However, we still have many areas within the diaphysis that is still only osteoid, which needs to be mineralized. Osteoid, it's strong, right? Because it contains quite a bit of collagen, contains proteoglycans and so forth, right? So it can resist compression. It's very resilient, but it doesn't have hydroxyapatite crystals. So without them throughout the whole shaft where we don't have the medullary cavity, the bone's not going to be able to resist the mechanical stress that it needs to, particularly the compression forces on the bone. So what's our solution? Well, osteoblasts secrete matrix vesicles, like we talked about, have that alkaline phosphatase in them, right? That contain calcium phosphate, which then combines with water to form hydroxyapatite. And the reason that happens is because alkaline phosphatase hydrolyzes water to break the bonds between the two phosphates in pyrophosphate. So now those phosphates are liberated. They can ionically bond with calciums, forming the ionically bonded calcium phosphate, which will precipitate out of solution, form crystals, particularly hydroxyapatite crystals, which form within and around collagen fibers, and that helps cement or stiffen the bone so it becomes rigid and can bear loads and compression forces. In addition to tension, right? Pull the bone apart, like when muscles contract and tendons pull on the bone. Now, we already have a primary ossification center, and that helped for ossification and mineralization of the diaphyseal bone, right, or the bone within the diaphysis, transforming it from cartilage to bone. We've got our marrow cavity formed, we're good to go. However, the epiphysis, we've been ignoring them, haven't we? The ends of the bones, they also have to ossify cartilage right now, right? That's a good thing because cartilage is very flexible. We can get lots of mitosis in there. We can get a bunch of chondrocytes in there to lay down cartilaginous matrix, and then eventually osteoblasts secreting osteoid and so forth, right? But the problem is the epiphysis are avascular, right? Because they have all that cartilage in them. And the chondrocytes, they can't hypertrophy or mineralize because of the avascularity or the lack of blood vessels up there. Remember, our blood vessels got plenty of them now in our diaphysis, but we need them up in the epiphysis now. So we can get water from the blood vessels to travel into the chondrocytes to make them get larger, right? Or to hypertrophy. So they can start releasing alkaline phosphatase and breaking apart those pyrophosphates so that we can form calcium phosphates, and that will precipitate out of solution and crystallize and harden our epiphysis. So what's our solution? Well, we need blood vessels to penetrate the epiphysis, and they do that. Again, the osteoclasts will leave the blood vessels where the diaphysis meets the epiphysis, right? And they will start resorbing bone there in the central cartilage, allowing for blood vessels to be able to get through there. While osteoblasts deposit osteoid around the remaining cartilage scaffold, which then eventually will mineralize into spongy bone. I mean, if that was all solid, compact bone up in the epiphysis, we couldn't get blood vessels through there. And those chondrocytes and osteoblasts and osteocytes and all of those cells would eventually die, right? Because they wouldn't get nutrients. So it's important that we have these secondary ossification centers in both epiphysis of the bone in order for the tissue in the epiphysis to be able to be vascularized, which means blood vessels getting to it. Those cells can receive nutrients, but also lay down osteoid and hydroxyapatite and all that good stuff that we talked about. Well, if this happened all the way to the surface of the bone, that would be great, but the problem is this bone tissue isn't smooth or as smooth as the osteoid and the hydroxyapatites, they're not as smooth as we'd like them. Remember, those hydroxyapatites are actually really, really sharp. So therefore, there would be a lot of friction when bones, right, two bones that make up a joint, when they moved and they rubbed against each other. Remember, a joint is where two bones meet, or that's where two bones join. Like, for example, your elbow joint is where your humerus meets the radius, right? It joins with the radius, or the ulna. That makes up your elbow joint. We want those bones to be covered with a smooth surface, preferably one that is moist, to reduce friction that could damage the surface of the bone. So what's our solution? Well, not all of those mesenchymal cells that were located in the inner perichondrium and eventually inner periosteum differentiate into osteoblasts. In fact, at the ends of the bones in the epiphysis, those mesenchymal cells differentiate into chondrocytes, and those chondrocytes remain in their lacuna. They make matrix and all that, but it's cartilaginous matrix that hopefully never hardens or gets mineralized because they don't undergo hypertrophy. The cartilage is avascular, so nutrients get there, but through diffusion, as we talked about before, right? And that's what limits the thickness of that articular cartilage. But what's great is that there's fluid that we're going to learn within many joints, particularly within synovial joints, which are freely movable joints, like the elbow joint, like I talked about, that helps bathe those articular cartilage surfaces to reduce the friction of them rubbing on each other, but also provides flexibility. And also that synovial fluid allows for nutrients to diffuse to those avascular articular cartilages, which again is hyaline cartilage, right? It's just not osteogenic cartilage. It's not going to turn into bone. It remains hyaline cartilage, which is still pretty tough, right? Because it's strong because it contains collagen and proteoglycans, and it's got some resiliency and some resistance to compression and tension, but it doesn't ossify. It doesn't undergo endochondral ossification. So therefore, that hyaline cartilage serves a great purpose for maintaining the smooth surface for joint movement. Now, another place that hyaline cartilage remains and doesn't become ossified is in the epiphyseal growth plate, which we'll talk about in the next video. Bone grows longitudinally or lengthwise from these epiphyseal plates or growth plates. If the whole bone had ossified, good luck laying down new matrix so that the bone will grow. Now, we're going to find that that does happen. Even in fully ossified bone, the matrix will get resorbed and by osteoclasts, and then osteoblasts will secrete new matrix, which we talked about before a little bit. Like, for example, when the bone was under mechanical stress, right? That's what stimulated that to happen. So the bone is constantly turning itself over. But as an adult, it's not growing in length. Well, without cartilage, because remember, in order for us to get longitudinal growth and even growth in width of the bone, we have to have cartilage for endochondral ossification to occur. That's different than bone remodeling. So if the whole bone, if the whole epiphysis and the whole diaphysis was nothing but osseous or bone tissue that's been hardened, right, with hydroxyapatite crystals, it's not going to lengthen. It'll remodel. It's just not going to lengthen. So our solution is to have a cartilage layer that remains as this epiphyseal plate, which allows for chondrocytes to proliferate and, very importantly, hypertrophy, right? Because when they hypertrophy, that's when, number one, they can release that alkaline phosphatase, which will break down or hydrolyze pyrophosphates so that we can get hydroxyapatite crystal formation, so they can penetrate through the vesicle and get deposited within the collagen of the matrix to harden that matrix. But what happens to those hypertrophied chondrocytes? Yeah, they die, right, through apoptosis. So that allows us to lay down more osteoblasts, lay down more matrix, which will then move or lengthen the diaphysis, sort of moving the epiphysis up, allowing for the growth of bone, which we'll talk all about next time. So blood vessels deliver osteoblasts, which then roll out of the blood vessel, right, via diapedesis, and they can then secrete osteoid and ossify the older cartilage on the diaphyseal, on the diaphysis side. We'll talk all about that in the next video. But remember, and this is key to understanding longitudinal postnatal bone growth, is that while the osteoblasts are laying down that matrix, right, on the diaphyseal side or on the shaft side or the diaphysis side of the epiphyseal plate, the epiphyseal plate has one side that is closer to the epiphysis and then another side that's closer to the diaphysis. So that matrix gets laid down on the diaphysis side, but what would eventually happen? That matrix would cover the cartilage, right? And that wouldn't be good, because then we wouldn't have any more cartilage and the bone couldn't grow anymore. It would grow like a centimeter and that would be it. However, remember, those hypertrophied chondrocytes, in addition to releasing alkaline phosphatase, which is helping us harden the matrix, they die, right? But that leaves room for the newly formed matrix on the diaphysis side to sort of push up or fill in the space where the dead cells were, so that epiphyseal plate never or doesn't decrease in size or in width. But again, we'll talk about that next time.